in the light of understanding of the harmony in existence, right, we can now look back and see what is the role of human being, okay, in this existence. Okay. So, if you look at this, we have till now been able to see that the existence is coexistence, right, which is in the form of units submerged in space. The human being is by virtue of coexistence and is embedded in coexistence. And in the light of these two things, we can see that all the human being needs to do is to understand the coexistence and live in coexistence. So, this is the basic role of human being, to understand the coexistence and live in coexistence. And we try to expand on this, right. This is how it looks like. To understand the coexistence has two parts: to understand the coexistence and to ensure the feeling and thought of coexistence. So, one is called the knowledge, the right understanding, the other is called resolution. And living in coexistence also has two parts: one is living in coexistence with human being, and number two is to live in coexistence in nature, right. So, living in harmony in coexistence with the human being is what we are calling as justice. Living in harmony with the entire nature is what we are calling as order, and when we expand it from family to world family, we have undivided society and universal human order. So, that basically is the role of human being in this existence, right. That is our role in existence. And if you look at this in little more detail, at the level of self, and then at the level of body, and then at the level of world outside, then this is how it looks like. So, if you look at the human being, it all begins with the realization of coexistence. So, realization of existence as coexistence, right. So, this is where it begins. In the light of realization of coexistence, the existence as coexistence, we can now understand the harmony in nature, and we can also contemplate on participation in the larger order, the relationship, right. And this clarity about coexistence, harmony and relationship essentially now guides our desire, our imaging, right, and ultimately the whole imagination part, right, the whole of B2. So, B2 is now guided in the light of B1, in the light of realization of coexistence, understanding of harmony and contemplation of relationship. When this happens, all our thought, all our desire, they fall in line with coexistence, in line with harmony and in line with relationship. And if that happens, then at the level of body, it is expressed in terms of behavior with human being, work with rest of nature and participation in the larger order, right. And if it is all guided by coexistence, harmony and relationship, then the behavior with human being leads to mutual happiness, the work with rest of nature leads to mutual prosperity, and participation in the larger order leads to fulfillment of human goal. And when we expand this from family to world family, it leads to undivided human society and universal human order. And the continuity of this universal human order, generation after generation, leads to human tradition. So, if you look at this whole picture, right, this is the basic role of human being in the existence, which is in the form of coexistence. So, it all begins with realization of coexistence, and it is completed with authentication of the universal human order. So, now if you look at it, this is the broad view of the human conduct, the definite human conduct, right. So, the broad view of definite human conduct is now can be seen in the form of this. So, it all begins with realization of coexistence, the existence as coexistence, understanding of harmony in nature and contemplation of the relationship, the participation in the larger order. Then it expands at the level of imagination in terms of how to ensure fulfillment in relationship and in order, in harmony. Okay. And then it expresses itself in terms of the behavior with human being leading to mutual happiness, work with rest of nature leading to mutual prosperity, and participation in the larger order leading to fulfillment of human goal. And if this is expanded right up to the world family, starting from family to world family, we have undivided society and universal human order. Right. And of course, ultimately the continuity of it, the tradition of it. So, this is the description of human conduct, right. Definite human conduct. And if you remember, we said right in the beginning, very first introduction, where we are talking about holistic development and role of education, right. We said the role of education is to facilitate the human being, the child who is going through education, to develop the competence to live with definite human conduct, right. Now, in the light of all that we have discussed till now, we can see what it really means. So, education would mean ensuring all this, starting from realization of coexistence to living in authentication in the form of universal human order. So, the education has to make us competent to do all this, and all this starting from realization to expression outside, right, is the definite human conduct. So, the definite human conduct starts with realization of coexistence and it completes with expression outside in terms of participation in the universal human order. Everything else falls in between.
So that means B1 is education and B2 is sanskar.
Yeah. So, this whole thing is the human conduct, right, and to ensure this human conduct, the major work has to be done first at the level of B2, then at the level of B1, right, and when B1 is there, right, completed, then guide this B2 in the light of this B1. So, that will be the total process of education and sanskar. So, now you can see that the education means ensuring this B1, the right understanding part, the realization, the understanding, the contemplation, and sanskar is ensuring this B2 in accordance with B1. So, B1 ensuring B1 is education, ensuring B2 in the light of B1 is sanskar. And if you look at all that we have to do in education, is that we have to start working with B2 first, that is placing the right kind of proposals at the level of imagination, right, working with that, then realizing the need of understanding, then work on B1, have the right understanding. In the light of right understanding, now ensure the right feeling and right thought, right, at the level of B2. So, that would be the education and sanskar, the process of education and sanskar, right. So, this is basically the definite human conduct. This is the description, this whole slide is the description of human conduct, starting from realization of coexistence and completing in expression outside in terms of universal human order. So, if we understand the existence and we understand the human being in this existence, then we can understand our role, okay, in this existence as coexistence. When we play this role, this is how it looks like, and this is the basic role of human being in this existence as coexistence. This is the definite human conduct. So, the definite human conduct that we talked about right in the beginning, saying that transition from animal consciousness to transformation from animal consciousness to human consciousness, and therefore, definite human conduct. Okay. This is what it means. So, when we are saying human consciousness, it means ensuring B1 and then B2 in the light of B1, that is the human consciousness. And human conduct means with B1 and B2, right, ensuring the right behavior, the right work and right participation in the larger order, ultimately leading to undivided society and universal human order. So, the role of education is basically to ensure first this human consciousness and then the human conduct. So, with clarity, with understanding of the existence as coexistence, we can have clarity about the human being in this coexistence, and therefore, the role of human being in this coexistence, and ultimately the human conduct, the definite human conduct. So, now with this clarity, if you place this back into the whole description of existence as coexistence that we had talked about, then we will see how the existence will look like, you know. So, if you do that, this is how it looks like, right. So, we said up to this point, this coexistence, existence as coexistence is unfolding itself, right, and this much has already happened, this much has already taken place. So, this much has already taken place by virtue of unfolding of this coexistence, right, this unit submerged in space. This has to happen by the effort of the human being, and that is what we are saying, that this is what human being has to do, right, through ensuring human consciousness at the level of self, and then human conduct at the level of, you know, self and body, right, and the world outside. And if this happens, then the process of unfolding of, you know, coexistence, the existence as coexistence, takes place in the form of universal human order. So, this is the total unfolding of the existence as coexistence, this is the total unfolding of the universal order, right. The major part of it is already, you know, completed or unfolded up to the existence of human order. What human being has to do is to understand this coexistence and live in this coexistence, therefore, do this part of the, you know, thing in coexistence, and if this is done, then the total process of unfolding of the coexistence is completed through human being in the form of universal human order. So, that is how the coexistence is realized in terms of universal human order, and of course, the continuity of it will show up in the form of human tradition. Completion of the role of human being in this coexistence also leads to the completion of the process of unfolding of existence as coexistence. So, the human being, when it completes its role in coexistence, it also results into the completion of the whole process of unfolding of the coexistence. So, this is where we are, right. Now, we are able to see, okay, what is existence, we are able to see what is human being in this existence, right, and then we are also able to see what is the role of human being in this coexistence, this existence as coexistence, and if that role is played by human being in this coexistence, then it will ultimately lead to the completion of the process of unfolding of this coexistence. Right. So, this much we have been able to see, and we can see that in the light of this, what we have been talking about right from the first lecture, right, we can now see that this transition from animal consciousness to human consciousness, okay, would essentially mean that when we are living with animal consciousness, we are living with this imagination, this B2 without B1, without right understanding, without realization, without contemplation, guided by preconditioning and sensation. This is living with animal consciousness. With right understanding, with all this exploration into existence as coexistence, the nature in harmony and relationship, we now reach to this state, right. This is living with human consciousness. So, human consciousness means awakening to this B1, the block B1, that is realization of coexistence, understanding of harmony and contemplation of relationship, the participation in the larger order. And then in the light of B1, right, B2 is rearranged or B2 is guided by B1, right. So, when this B1 and B2 is completed in this manner, this is living with human consciousness. So, the role of education and sanskar basically is to ensure this transformation at the level of individual from animal consciousness to human consciousness, from the state where we are living only at the level of B2 to a state where we have B1 completed and B2 in the light of B1 completed.
What is that activity completeness?
Yeah. So, this can also be seen as activity completeness and conduct completeness that we were talking about when we were talking about existence, and unfolding the coexistence. So, reaching right up to B1, the realization of coexistence is the activity completeness, and then ensuring that B2 is in the light of B1 is conduct completeness, the status of complete conduct completeness, which can now be expressed in terms of the conduct outside. So, this is the transition from animal consciousness to human consciousness, and this is the role of education. If you look at this at the level of society, okay, this is how it will look like. Okay. At the level of consciousness, at the level of individual, this is the consciousness with which we are living without right understanding. So, the animal consciousness, right. And if we are living with animal consciousness, this will give rise to a society like this, and this we have talked about quite in detail, right. This we have talked about quite in detail, that if we are living with animal consciousness, if we are living with B2 which is guided by imagination, by preconditioning and sensation, we will have a society like this that we have today. On the other hand, we said that if we have we are living with human consciousness, if we are living like this, then this will give rise to a society like this, right, and that is what is desirable. So, if you look at it at the level of society, okay, with animal consciousness we give rise to a society which is inhuman, right, which is more like crowd or battlefield. If we live with a human consciousness and human conduct, then it gives rise to a society which is human society, right. So, this will give rise to human society. So, basically when we are talking about this transition, and that is what we are, this transformation, this is what we are calling as progress. The real progress has to take place, okay, at the level of individual in terms of human consciousness and human conduct, and it will take place at the level of society in terms of human society. Human society, starting with the family and completing in the world family order, right. That is what is universal human order. So, this universal human order is the ultimate society that we would like to have, right. So, the transformation, the progress, the development would mean transiting from animal consciousness to human consciousness at the level of individual, and transiting from inhuman society to human society at the level of society. Right. So, this universal human order is basically the holistic development. So, when you talk in terms of holistic development, when you talk in terms of the real progress, it is realization of this universal human order through human consciousness. And the role of education is basically to ensure this transformation from animal consciousness to human consciousness, from inhuman society to human society. Right. So, role of human being, right, is realization of coexistence and ultimately ensuring universal human order. The societal transformation takes place through personal transformation. So, if the personal transformation takes place, it will give rise to societal transformation. And what we are saying that if societal transformation takes place, then it will provide right kind of education and sanskar, to the next generation, and therefore, it will become a source of personal transformation. So, then it will become an cyclic process, personal transformation leading to societal transformation, and this societal transformation ensuring right education and sanskar for the next generation, thereby ensuring the personal transformation, and that is how the tradition will continue. So, this is what we have been trying to look at right from the beginning, when we said the role of education and sanskar is to ensure this transformation from animal consciousness to human consciousness. This is what we meant, right, from animal consciousness to human consciousness, from inhuman conduct to human conduct, from inhuman society to human society. That was the journey that we were indicating when we were saying this transformation from animal consciousness to human consciousness. And we said that the role of education is to enable this transformation, to ensure this transformation, and to continue with this process of transformation. So, good. So, if we have this ensured, this kind of human consciousness in human society, right, then we can see that this universal human order, which is resulted by way of human consciousness, by way of human conduct, right, then this will be the dynamics, right. This will be the dynamics, right. That is, if we have human education, that is education that ensures the development of the competence to live with definite human conduct through human consciousness, then it will lead to human conduct, right. It will lead to human conduct, conduct that ensures continuity of mutual happiness and prosperity, right. People who are competent to live with mutual happiness, mutual prosperity and fulfillment of human goal. That is what we said about human conduct right now. When there are people living with human conduct, right, then you can find out how the human constitution would look like, right. That is the nature of society of people living together in a relationship of mutual fulfillment, right. So, the nature of society of people living together, people living with definite conduct and living together in a relationship of mutual fulfillment, that will be the basic constitution, right. And if the human constitution is there, right, it will give rise to universal human order. And we saw that when we have universal human order, it will ensure right education and sanskar for every child. So, it will ensure right education and sanskar for every child. Therefore, it will ensure human education, right. So, ultimately this cycle can be completed. This is the dynamics of universal human order. So, once this cycle is completed, it will go on generation after generation. The universal human order will ensure right education and sanskar for the next generation, which will ensure human conduct in the next generation, which will ensure human constitution or the acceptance of human constitution in the next generation, and the next generation will be able to participate in the universal human order, and then it will go on. So, this is the dynamics of universal human order. And now, if you look at the entry point, that now that we do not have this universal human order, how do we start? Where do we start? What is the entry point? Okay. So, if you look at that, this is the entry point. Providing human education and sanskar is the entry point for ensuring the dynamics, okay, this cycle of universal human order. And that is what we are saying right from the beginning. We are saying that the role of education and sanskar is very primary when it comes to human being. Now, we can see it is very primary when it comes to ensuring right human conduct, when it comes to ensuring the human society, right. So, that is the entry point. So, we start with human education or introducing the human education and sanskar first for ourselves, then for the children, right, and then in higher education and so on, right. So, all this can be done, okay, beginning with ourselves, but this whole dynamic has to start with human education, and that is why we are talking about introduction of human education, right, in the mainstream education. At least it has to be introduced as a subject, as a proposal, which everyone can explore, understand, accept, right, and try to live with it. And once they are able to see and appreciate it, they will be able to multiply. So, first for the policy makers, then for the teachers, then for the students, right, the parents and so on. So, this is the entry point. The human education is the entry point, and that is what we are intending for, right. So, we are beginning with introduction of it as a subject in the form of proposal, but then we will see as we go on, right, that this is the first step, okay, and systematically it has to be made the basis of education and sanskar, right. And once it becomes the basis of education and sanskar, and there are people with human conduct, definite human conduct, then we can think in terms of human constitution and ultimately work for universal human order. So, those steps we will talk about as we go on. So, this is the dynamics okay, of universal human order, and the entry point is the human education, and that is what we are working on. So, with all this kind of investigation and exploration and understanding, okay, now we can see that what we have been talking about all through can be summed up in a very kind of brief, okay, particularly in the light of understanding of the existence as coexistence. So, when you understand the coexistence as the existence as coexistence, and when you look back on what we have talked about the nature, the harmony in nature, about the harmony in society and harmony in family and so on, we will be able to see that all that is reflection of existence as coexistence. So, let us look at that brief summary. So, all that we have talked about is essentially this, right, and the main thing, the core thing is understanding the existence as coexistence, right. And if we can understand that, we can also see that all that we have talked about nature, the society, the family, the individual is just the reflection of this coexistence. So, let me explain that, just read it out and explain. We have already talked about all this, but it is good to see the whole thing from top. So, if you look have the top view of all that we have discussed, top view in the sense that now we have gone right up to existence and we have understood the existence as coexistence, Then from there when you look down upon the level of nature, at the level of society and so on, how does it look like? Right. So, the basic thing that to understand is this: the existence is in the form of coexistence, which is in the form of unit submerged in space. So, existence is in the form of coexistence, which is in the form of unit submerged in space. So, really speaking, the core thing to understand is the coexistence, existence as coexistence, right. If we understand this, and if we can see that the whole existence is in the form of coexistence, which is in the form of unit submerged in space, then we can clearly see what we have talked about nature, right. The nature as collection of unit in a relationship of mutual fulfillment, right, amongst the unit and amongst the 4 orders. So, when we can see that the units are submerged in space, right, that means every unit in space is related to every other unit in space in a mutually fulfilling manner. So, if we understand coexistence, we can understand the mutual fulfillment in nature by understanding this coexistence. So, basically the mutual fulfillment amongst the 4 orders, amongst the units in nature, is an expression of the coexistence, expression of the unit submerged in space, right. So, coexistence is expressing itself in the form of mutual fulfillment at the level of nature. When you look at the level of society, we talked about these 4 human goals: the right understanding, the prosperity, the fearlessness, trust and coexistence, right. So, this has to do with human nature relationship, the natural law and the 5 dimensions of human order, right. So, if you look at right understanding, this is basically understanding of coexistence. So, if you now look back and ask what is right understanding, it means right understanding means understanding of the coexistence, understanding the existence as coexistence. If you look at prosperity, this prosperity is essentially ensuring the coexistence of human being with rest of nature, which results into prosperity in human being and preservation of rest of nature. So, prosperity is basically the outcome of coexistence of human being with rest of nature. If you look at this fearlessness trust, it is the coexistence of human being with human being, right, and ultimately the coexistence is coexistence anyway, right. So, all that we talked about in society or harmony in society, what we meant was understanding the coexistence and living in coexistence, right, living in coexistence with human being, living in coexistence with rest of nature and ultimately living in coexistence with entire nature, right. Then come down, right, when you talk about family, right, it is feeling of coexistence, right, basically. So, all the feeling that we talked about in relationship like trust, respect, affection and ultimately the love, all these are basically talking about the coexistence between one human being and another human being, right. So, this human relationship, the justice is basically the coexistence of human being with human being. And when we come down further, at the level of individual, it is basically the coexistence of self and body, right, which expresses itself in the form of Sanyam in the self and health in the body. And when you still come down and look at the level of self, right, it is expressed in terms of continuous happiness, right, which is happiness, peace, satisfaction and bliss, right. And this continuous happiness is ensured by way of realization of coexistence, by way of understanding the harmony in nature, by way of contemplation of the participation in the larger order, right, leading to definiteness of desire on this basis definiteness of feeling and thought of relationship and order, this ultimately leading to behavior, work and participation in the larger order. So, the realization of coexistence at the level of self, understanding of harmony in nature at the level of self, contemplation of the participation in the larger order, and ultimately leading to definiteness of desire, the feeling and the thought. All this essentially means understanding the coexistence and feeling and thought of coexistence. If that happens, there is harmony within the self, and therefore, there is a state of continuous happiness in the self, right. So, there is a continuity of happiness at the level of self. So, if you now see all that we have talked about, starting from individual to family to society to nature, okay, is essentially the expression of this existence as coexistence at different level. So, this existence as coexistence is unfolding itself at the level of nature in the form of mutual fulfillment in nature. It is unfolding itself in the form of right understanding, the prosperity, the fearlessness and coexistence at the level of society. It is unfolding itself in the form of feeling of coexistence with other human being at the level of family. It is expressing itself at the level of individual in the form of coexistence between self and body, and ultimately at the level of self it is expressing itself in terms of realization of coexistence, understanding of harmony and having the feeling and thought of coexistence, ultimately leading to harmony at the level of self and therefore, a state of continuous happiness in the self. So, this is all that we have talked about. So, if the whole thing has to be summed up, right, it can be summed up in one simple slide, and if this slide has to be summed up, right, it can be summed up in one word, right, the coexistence. So, all through we have been talking about coexistence, the understanding of coexistence, the feeling of coexistence, the thought of coexistence and living in coexistence with human being, with rest of nature and ultimately with entire nature. So, in a sense this is what we have been talking about all through. So, if the whole thing has to be summed up, right, okay, it can be summed up in one word, and that is coexistence. Everything that we talked about is unfolding of this coexistence. So, good, with this understanding of coexistence, right, with this realization of coexistence, okay, all now we need to do is to have the feeling and thought of coexistence and then live in coexistence with human being, with rest of nature and with entire nature, starting from family order to world family order. So, that is all that we need to do. So, this essentially is what we have talked about, and then in the light of this we can try to unfold how we go about it, what will be our program of action, right, how this transition from the present state to this state of universal human order would take place. So, good, thank you very much. If there are questions, we will take it up. Thank you.